Hello and welcome to The Discussion. This channel is here to serve as a platform for thoughtful conversations about God, philosophy, history, religion, music, and more. My name is Nahoa, and I'm here to ask questions, to seek truth openly and critically, and to share the journey with you. I just wrapped up a school project. My teachers wanted me and my teammates to recreate a piece of fine art from the 1960s. The common approaches would normally involve paintings or sculptures or something, but I asked if we could submit a cover of a song from that era, since music has traditionally been included among the fine arts. However, one of our teachers, who happens to really enjoy music from the 60s, said that our song better be exceptional, because although there is artful music, not all music is artful. I asked, wouldn't that same reasoning apply to paintings, which you would more easily accept? But he still maintained that if we submitted a song instead of a painting, he would need extra convincing to give us a good grade. So my team took the safe bet of a painting for the sake of our grades, but the whole process got me thinking about the distinction between art and music. All the while, I was listening to lots of music, especially hip hop and jazz, and I was reading The Philosophy of Western Music, a contemporary introduction by the scholar joining and teaching us today. This scholar earned his bachelor's and master's at the University of Auckland, and he earned his doctorate at the University of Maryland. He's currently a professor of philosophy at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. I've really enjoyed reading his material, and I'm excited to talk with him about music, which I love so much. So, without further introduction, Dr. Andrew Kania, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks, Naho. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you. In my introduction, I mentioned the distinction between art and music, so let's start with that. Even though it's notoriously difficult to define either of those concepts, could you help us understand how the two concepts overlap and how they diverge?
Yeah, well, I think in a way there's like a bunch of different concepts in this ballpark, right? So the word art gets used in maybe at least three different ways. There's a kind of very broad sense of it as like all of the arts. So like music would count as an art. Um, and then there's a kind of narrow sense where art is often used to mean something like the visual arts, like you're talking about paintings
Mm,
and sculptures. And then there's this interesting kind of distinction. You mentioned the term fine art as well. Um, and the fine arts is a kind of a historical concept. I mean, in the 18th century, I guess people started talking about the fine arts in the Western philosophical tradition, and it was a very specific list, right? It included some arts and it didn't include others. And these days, there's sometimes maybe this is four different distinctions. People make a distinction between it's controversial what to call it, but like high art, but I feel like fine
mm,
art often gets used for that concept, and popular art. Um, so there's all of those concepts on the art side. And so I can imagine, I'd really like to hear more about this assignment actually, and then like why music was kind of singled out as somehow inappropriate or not matching the assignment this way. But if if the teacher was making a distinction between sort of fine arts and popular arts, I don't know if their idea was kind of like you could produce a musical performance, but it can't be popular art. Right?
mm,
Just like you could do a painting or a sculpture or like a work of, I don't know, classical music or something, because that's fine art, but
mm,
that's not popular art. But I don't know. So anyway, there's a bunch of art concepts. And then, of course, there's the concept of music. Um, the way I like to think of it, I think of music as a medium, a little bit like language.
mm,
So language isn't an art, but you can put language to artistic uses. You can do artistic things with language, and we call that
mm,
literature. I like to think of music, though this is my own view. I don't think everyone would agree with me. I like to think of music like that. It's a medium in which you can do stuff, and sometimes that medium is put to artistic uses, in which case we call it music,
mm,
and sometimes it's put to non-artistic uses, in which case we call it music. So
Mm.
one of the problems in English is like we don't have the separate word. We have the separate word for artistic language, which is literature, but we don't really have a word. I mean, we don't have it in visual art either. We do talk about paintings and sculptures, but it's not like we have a kind of, pictures is kind of the non-artistic, most general
Mm.
kind of word. But we don't really have a word for artistic pictures. There's paintings and prints and films, but there's not one single word like literature. And in music, we don't really have any word at all. We just have this word music that we use in all sorts of different ways to refer to like the music on a commercial, a popular music track, music of Beethoven, ancient music from all around the world. It's like we're trying to get this one word to do a lot of work.
Mm. Yeah, I'm not sure why the teacher um, wouldn't count it. I mean, and it's nothing against him. This is a good teacher.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it might have just been he how is he supposed to grade it? Like how is he supposed
Uh,
to grade how good the song is? It just do you think that there's a difference in the way that people respect music as an art form rather than how they respect the visual arts?
well, that is a really interesting question. I feel like there are similarities and differences, and in a way, I feel like this is almost a question for like an art historian
Mm,
or anthropologist or sociologist. I feel like there's this definite distinction, at least in the Western traditional Western culture, where classical music has long been considered this like high art form, and all other music's kind of considered popular music and somehow kind of therefore less valuable or something. Um, that's undergone a lot of changes. I mean, jazz, for instance, I feel like people used to sort of denigrate jazz in the first half of the 20th century as kind of just popular music and noise and not good and that kind of
hmm.
thing. I feel like that view has totally gone away. Nobody would say that about
Right.
jazz anymore. In a way, jazz has sort of taken its place as a kind of classical music. There are people who talk about jazz as America's classical music, right? It's
Mm,
this kind of high art music form that's come out of American culture in particular. Uh, but certainly, I mean, in the academy, when you talk to philosophers and musicologists and so on, very few people would want to draw this distinction between like high art, including music, and popular art, including popular music, as a kind of value distinction
mm,
anymore. I think everyone's on board with the idea that kind of distinction is just a kind of false distinction that's tied up with kind of politics and socioeconomic reality, right? Basically, like, classical music was the music of kind of rich white people, to put it
mm.
really bluntly, and that's why it was considered, the best. Um, Now, visual art I know a lot less about, but when I think of painting, I sort of think, well, if you're making paintings, you're just doing high art. There's not a kind of a low art version, but that's not really true, right? There's all sorts of popular visual arts. So you might think of like murals. I feel like they're
Mm.
having a huge resurgence at the moment. Certainly in San Antonio, I know some other cities like San Francisco are known for their murals. So sort of public art um, and posters are also maybe an example or two in the background. Definitely visual art, I would say, but not as likely to be found in like MoMA or the Whitney or something because they're
Right.
considered more popular, more commercial. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. I'm assuming for this assignment, the idea was you're supposed to recreate a painting or a sculpture, as you said, and not a kind of poster for Woodstock, for instance, even though that would be visual art in a sense.
Yeah, yeah, it was that it needs to be fine art, and the way they defined it is, it's meant it has purely aesthetic purposes, right? So we couldn't do a poster that was propaganda, or
Ah,
if we did a song, maybe we
ah,
couldn't do like the national anthem, right? Because it can't be things like
right,
that.
right.
It needs to treat itself, or maybe the experience of itself as art, as the end. Um,
I
which
see.
gets tricky because then you wonder, how do you define aesthetics? But then also,
Right.
there seems to be lots of music whose chief goal is not just aesthetics, but it's still artful, right? Like, early jazz and antecedents of jazz, where it's just a dancing music. The goal is to get people to move, but you could argue it's still artful, right? Or like dance pop, Michael Jackson, was he I don't know what his intentions were, but one of the intentions was definitely to get people to dance. But still, you could
Right.
argue that his classic
Absolutely.
albums are artful. So I don't
Yeah.
really, yeah, I'm not going to contest the rubric too much. I want the A.
Right. Right.
But it got me
Yeah.
thinking
Right.
about how to define aesthetics and what a song's goal needs to be in order for it to be considered art, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, absolutely. I'm the same. I'm not criticizing the assignment or the teacher or anything. It sounds like a very interesting project, but partly it's interesting because of these questions it raises.
Right.
I mean, I would also say again, it would be interesting to if there was some way to crunch the numbers, but everything you just said about music sounds like it applies to at least a lot of visual art, right? So I
Mm,
mean, don't ask me to actually name the decade, but Jasper John's American flag paintings, right? They're paintings that they just look like an American flag. I mean, they're obviously paintings; they're not made of fabric or something.
all right.
But that's a classic painting from the 20th century in American art
Mm,
history. But it's clearly got political content. It's clearly not just aesthetic. If aesthetic is supposed to
mm,
mean something like disengage from real world affairs, Mark Rothko, these very abstract paintings, but still a lot of people think they're somehow spiritual. They're supposed to kind of put you in touch with some profound truths.
mm.
It's not clear whether that's going to count as like purely aesthetic, because again, it's trying to get you to think about the real world outside the artwork. Um, so it's an interesting way of kind of narrowing down the target artworks. I would think it's going to narrow it down quite a lot.
Yeah. But you talked about the way you think of music is as a medium. So sometimes it could be used as a medium for art and other times for, to wake you up, right? Or to
Right.
accompany a film. But even that could probably be uh, strategic or artful, the way that music is incorporated into cinema. But if music is a medium, then would you say that it can't be an end in and of itself, right? The end is always some experience. You know what I mean?
I think that's right. Yeah. Again, if you think about the parallel with language, like what is language for? Um, I mean, I guess you could say in some sense it's for communication, but of course you can communicate with language in a lot of different ways.
Hmm.
And similarly with music, yeah, I would say um, everything, almost everything we do with music is designed in some way to be taken up by an audience. I mean, sometimes
Mm,
that audience is just ourselves. But yeah, it's hard to imagine how you could think the value of music was disconnected from some sort of experience of the music.
mm,
Um, but yeah, I think the main point of thinking about it as a medium is to push back against the view that a lot of philosophers, even quite recently, have defended, which is some variation on the kind of slogan that music is the art of sound.
mm,
They think a lot of philosophers have tried to make being artistic an essential part of being music, as a necessary condition for being music. And I think that confuses two different ways in which we use the term, the sort of medium term and the artistic use of the medium term.
mm. You keep making this analogy between music and language, but in your book you said that there's pretty widespread consensus among philosophers of music and linguists that music is not actually a language, and the reasons had to do with like you can't identify a smallest unit of meaning. Like in a language, it's a word. In music, is it the note or like what part of the note is the smallest? And there's no equivalent of grammar, right, to structure meaning. But I, and I know I'm saying it right now, but I honestly can't really grasp the reasons why this is kind of widely agreed upon. So could you help me understand why music isn't thought of as a language?
Yeah, well, you've done a great job summarizing some of the basic arguments, and I think what makes the what makes the point a bit confusing is it's like, well, what do we mean when we say music is a language?
Mm,
So in the book, for instance, I think I say that it's a useful metaphor, um, partly because it can help us think about parallels between music and language, as you point out that I've just been doing.
mhm,
Um, but some people want to take the analogy further and make it literal,
mm,
like as opposed to just an analogy or metaphor. Um, and for that to be the case, you've got to think, okay, well, what's actually being said here? And the idea is for that to be a kind of substantial claim and not just an analogy or metaphor, we want to be saying that music is the kind of thing that English is, or Spanish is, or Japanese is, or so on and
mm,
so forth, right? Those things are languages. Is music one more of those? So to do that, you've got to find something like features that all and only languages have, and say that music has those features too. And that's why the arguments start talking about very kind of specific linguistic features like words, right? Smallest units of meaning, which have conventional and arbitrary meanings, right? There's nothing essential to the letters DOG that means it has to be about a
mm,
canine animal, right? That's why in different languages we have totally different words for the same animal. And as you say, like syntax about how words get structured into sentences, following certain kind of rules. Those kinds of rules are not present in music. And the idea is, well, if those essential features of language are not present in music, what do we mean by saying that music is a language? It starts to look like music isn't a language, even though it might share some features with language.
mm,
But it turns out when you look at the features that music does share with language, those are features that language also shares with a whole bunch of other things. Like one of the theorists I quote in the book, I think Ray Jackendorf, who is very much a kind of linguist, philosopher of language. He points out that these kind of complicated structures. So music certainly has or can have very kind of complicated structures that can look a bit like, you can represent them like grammatical sentence trees, right?
mhm,
But it turns out that those structures are in common to all sorts of human actions. So he gives this example, I think, of like when you make a cup of coffee, that process also has a structure of this sort. But making a cup of coffee isn't a language. So just showing that music has that same kind of structure isn't going to show that music's a language. That is, language has some features that it shares with lots of other kind of human activities or practices. So it wouldn't be surprising if music also shares those very general properties because it's also a human activity or practice.
mm. Right. I think but so we can't think of principles of music theory as grammatical principles in any sense greater than a metaphorical sense.
Yeah, metaphorical or analogical.
Mm.
Yeah,
It's just I think it's hard for me to let go of this idea because it's so
yeah,
common to say, "Oh yeah, music is like Stevie Wonder said, music is a world within itself, a language we all understand." And I've grown up with
yeah,
that, so that's something that like
yeah,
just always assumed is exactly right. Plus, when I think of
yeah,
musicians, say on a bandstand, not saying anything with their mouth, but they're playing these chords and then they look at each other, right? So maybe there's some nonverbal like bodily communication going on, and then like okay, we're gonna walk up basically, and then they do things in unison. It seems like they are
uh-huh,
genuinely communicating in a significant
yeah,
nonverbal way. But I don't know if mere communication is enough to make it linguistic, or I don't know if meaning
right,
is enough to make it linguistic because or if the ability to arouse emotions, like someone listens to if someone could listen to a speech, right, spoken of course in a language, and then cry or be convicted or change their lives, and someone could listen to an album and cry or be convicted or change religions, things like that, and so it seems like there's just all these reasons for me to want to see music as a language, but I'm just not sure
Yeah,
how much sense that makes
yeah,
in a literal way.
yeah. Well, again, I think it does depend a lot on what you mean by language,
Mm,
and that's the only thing sort of being denied, that music's a language in a very specific sense. So you've talked about communication a lot. Certainly wouldn't want to deny that music is a form of communication. But as you said, uh, it seems like pictures do this too,
right?
right? So you can paint a picture that communicates ideas to people, that arouses emotions in people, that could have a kind of religious effect on people. I see a
Hmm.
photo like, I mean, a picture like that in the background
Yeah,
here.
there you go.
Um, uh, so are pictures a language? Again, I want to say it's fine to say that as long as you're clear on what you mean by the word
Mm,
language. But if you start talking about, grammar and vocabulary, those sorts of things are going to be only analogies with languages like English, French, Spanish, etc. Right? Um, so it is, in some sense, a kind of technical distinction, but I think it's an important one because I think sometimes people do start with the broader sense, right, in which it's perfectly acceptable to say music's a language because it's a means of communication. Um, but then try to kind of push the analogy or the metaphor too far,
mm,
particularly by thinking about things like, does music have a grammar? I think that can be a kind of a little bit dangerous, because you're looking for something that I mean, I think is not there. This can sound sort of very negative, right? It's like sort of shutting down the
no,
music as
no,
a
yeah.
language thing. But a positive sort of spin to put on it is that, I mean, a bit like pictures too, I would say. It's amazing how all of these different media are capable of communicating things, or how we're
Mm,
capable of using these things to communicate. And I think coming to music, thinking of it as its own thing, like how does it do this given that it's not a language,
mm,
given that it's not literally painting pictures? I think that's a really fascinating and difficult question. Um, and in a way, I think it's more fascinating and more difficult if we think music is kind of, sui generis, its own kind of medium,
mm.
very different from pictures and language.
Yeah.
That's a more positive spin on the same coin.
No, yeah, and it's interesting to see the ways that we talk about the different media with language from like we'll talk about a painting as poetic or a poem as musical, right? Or a song painted a vivid picture, right?
Right,
The album was cinematic, right? So even bringing in film,
right,
it's and
yeah, yeah,
that doesn't mean you're literally saying the that the album is a movie, right? But you could
yeah,
be
right,
saying that it's analogous in that maybe there's drama or a story unfolds and it's
right,
cool to compare those, but it's also difficult to give definitions. I mean, in almost any philosophical subfield, I realize it's hard to give a definition of pretty much anything interesting and where the definition has no exceptions, right? So it's hard to define beauty, art,
right,
music, justice, knowledge, things like that. I talked to epistemologist Dr. Michael Humer, who said that I mean, he's worked on conceptualizing knowledge, but he says we don't have a complete epistemological account, and that obsessing over perfect definitions isn't fruitful. And then I learned from Buddhist philosophy about nominalism, and as I see problems with setting distinct parameters, I sympathize a little more and more with nominalists. So I wonder what you think of nominalism, and maybe you'll have to explain that to the audience, and the view that definitions aren't always helpful in understanding conventions, right? So maybe that music is just a conventional phenomenon and not like a set sort of thing.
right. Yes, well, so that's a good way of introducing nominalism, I think. Nominalism is usually considered a fundamental kind of physical approach to the world, I guess, often opposed to realism. The basic idea is the realists think that for at least some of our concepts, we are kind of matching reality. Like there really are, for instance, dogs and cats out
Mm.
there. They're different kinds of things. We have these concepts that match that reality. Nominalists typically think that these are just human constructions, as you said, kind of conventions. Maybe that's useful for us to distinguish between dogs and cats, but it's not like that distinction is really out there in the world. We are imposing that distinction on the world with our language and thought. Um, Now I've forgotten what context you raised this in. We can connect with music.
Yeah, just wondering,
Oh,
what if we view, in a sort of nominalist fashion, if we view music as as a category, just as a convention, rather than
yeah.
there is a definition of this set of musical things.
It's certainly one way you could go. I would resist going all the way to nominalism, understood in that way, just because I think there's lots of possible ways of approaching those sorts of questions that are in the middle.
Hmm.
So if you go all the way to nominalism, you say something like, look, it just really isn't anything we could call music. I mean, we call it music, but there's nothing actually out there in the world.
Hmm.
Um, I It just seems like if we can resist that extreme of view, we should. So it's worth at least exploring what the kind of middle options are. So one middle option is to say, yeah, maybe music is the sort of thing that we can't have a definition of in terms of precise, necessary, and sufficient conditions, such that it's going to accurately rule um, everything either in or out of the category of music.
Right.
But there are other ways of approaching defining music. I mean, one would be sort of one step towards the sort of nominalistic end, but without going all the way to nominalism, would be to say, well, we can have necessary and sufficient conditions, but they can be vague, right?
Mm.
So maybe I mean, I don't think this is actually plausible, but somebody might say, it has to have rhythm to be music,
Mm.
or it has to have pitch. And then you ask, well, what is rhythm? What is pitch? And maybe it turns out, well, we kind of understand the paradigms, and we've got a good sense of some things that are clearly not rhythmic and things that really are rhythmic, but there's all this kind of like gray area at the edges. So it's going to be kind of vague, but maybe that's just the way music is. Maybe it's a vague aspect of reality. Another way people have tried to do it is by
Because
called,
vague doesn't mean ineffable, right? Like you're defining it as vague, so it's not nominalist, but it's not so.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
for instance, you might get the way some people put this is like if you get the definition right, it's going to count the clear cases in and the clear cases out. That is of music and non-music, and the kind of borderline cases where we're not sure, they'll come out as borderline cases, right? So
There you
maybe
go.
some sort of avant-garde works like John Cage's 4 minutes 33, for instance. It doesn't have any sounds, but it's kind of presented in a musical context. It gets discussed in the history of music. So is it music? Well, it sort of seems music-ish. So maybe if we got a definition which sort of said, well, John Cage's 4 minutes 33 is kind of like on the borderline, we can't tell if it's in or out, maybe that would be a good feature of the definition. Because maybe its vagueness matches the vagueness of our musical practices, if you like.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I
Another
mean,
thing. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say another way people do this is by using prototype theories. Prototype theory is a different kind of theory. So instead of necessary and sufficient conditions, you identify the paradigms of music, in this case, for instance, and then you say, like, the more similar things are to those paradigms, the more justifiable it is to call them music, and the further away, the less justifiable. But again, you're going to get like obvious kind of like vagueness there. It's not going to be a clear cut kind of what's music, what isn't. So the idea is like it allows you to talk about music as a thing without having to like pin down these precise borders to the concept.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I've never heard of that. I took
Mm.
a philosophy class at a university last semester, and the way they presented definitions was in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, which is
Yeah.
how it normally is, especially in the West. But I just wasn't aware that there were prototype theories. So if we're if we're if we explore something like that a little bit more in music, are there specific paradigmatic cases that you could point to? Like what would that be, a song or a genre, an artist, an album, you know?
Mm. Well, that's the thing. So here the difficulty starts, right, for the prototype theorist. Yeah. So identify the paradigms. Presumably, lots are going to be controversial. The idea is that the paradigms would be things that no one would deny are music. Um, but what's actually an account, I think, is going to be tricky. So, for instance, I would want to say that songs shouldn't be in the paradigm because I think songs are a kind of hybrid form because they use two different media, um, music and language.
Mm,
Uh, so I would put instrumental music in as the paradigms, though I would want to include music from all sorts of different cultures because I think music is a concept that has application in all cultures. Uh, so you'd have to have paradigms there from a wide variety of musics. That's going to be a little controversial. But then, of course, um, the resemblance question, right? So when you start moving away from the paradigms, you open a whole other can of worms because you ask, like, for the theory to have any sort of content at all, there's got to be some story about the ways in which things have to resemble the paradigms. So, for instance, if there's some, if there's some Brahms in the paradigms, um, and then I say, well, I guess books are pretty musical because they also start with B.
mm.
It's like, no, that's a resemblance, but that's not a relevant resemblance, right? That's irrelevant to whether something's close to the paradigms. It has to be close to the paradigms in, I guess, the difficulty, right? What are you going to say?
Right.
You might say things like, well, it has to have the same kinds of, sounds or something. So song is close because it does have words, but crucially it has like pitches and rhythms and harmonies and stuff like that. So it counts as close to the paradigms. The trouble is, as soon as you start doing this, it starts to sound a lot like you're offering a definition of music in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, right? It's
Yeah.
like it has to have sounds and pitch and everything. It sort of sounds like, oh, wait, now we're coming back to this way of approaching it that we thought we were leaving behind. And so you find, as often in philosophy, you've got this new approach, but then it turns out the same kinds of problems start
Mm.
to arise, or parallel kinds of problems.
Another problem with the paradigm approach seems to be if if you take, a paradigm A and then you have some case in question B and it's super close, it would count really well on this view, but be um it might not be actually an admirable piece of work because it's so close to the paradigm, right? There's nothing really original about it. It's almost an imitation. Um, oh,
Yeah.
but then if there's something that's so far, that definition uh, doesn't. It's not fav. Hmm it's not favorable to experimentation, right? Like if there's something that uses all sorts of different sounds and like when the Beatles had as their lead guitar a reverse lead guitar, right? In Revolver, when you have all this experimentation or you're gonna record things in different ways and then mix your vocals so that they're underneath all the music and it doesn't sound like the ones we can all agree on, but still I feel like having agreeability shouldn't be a condition for music, or even for good music, because there could be
Yeah.
in principle a music that a piece of music that is good, beautiful, even if most of us or all of us maybe dislike it. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. Well, I feel like two things about that. I mean,
Yeah.
one is that it sounds like maybe we're shifting topic. So the the prototype theory or the definitions of music are typically not um, intended to be evaluative, right? So
Right.
the
Okay.
idea is highly derivative musical works can be just as much music. The fact that they're highly derivative doesn't make them less musical. It just makes them less good, we
Mm.
might say.
Right.
But the question of the definition of music is a descriptive question. It's kind of independent of the
Mm,
value questions. Um, but the other issue, so we can talk about value for sure. The other issue was that, right, all of that stuff about being creative, you don't want to rule out creative, innovative music in virtue of the kind of resemblance principles you give. I think that's absolutely right. It's got to be a criterion. Um, and that's why I think the principles of resemblance are going to be extremely kind of general and abstract, and draw on things that appear in more traditional definitions in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Again, for me, that would be something like pitches, rhythms, sort of these basic musical features. Because although you want to allow innovation, it seems like you don't want to allow just anything. So, for instance, if somebody says, "Well, look, I'm really kind of breaking the boundaries. Like, forget John Cage, forget the Beatles. Here's my new piece of music."
mm,
Somebody says, "Wait, what do you mean? Am I supposed to listen to it?" It's like, no, no, no. You're supposed to, put drinks in it, and then like, put the drinks into your body like this. It's like that sounds like you just created a glass or a cup or something, right? It's not music. It's like, well, who are you to say what's music? It's
mm.
like, hold on. This doesn't count as
Right.
like innovative creativity unless you're doing some weird kind of, conceptual art thing or something. It's like you're just confused. Like a
Mm,
cup is not music. Um, you might be able to find some resemblances between them, but that's just too far out. So the principles of resemblance are going to have to exclude some things or put some things way out on the borderlines. Um, but you're right; they're going to have to be quite general. They're going to have to not include things about style or even a
mm.
particular harmonic system. That's why I think you'd have to have the paradigms from a huge range of musical cultures across the globe, and across time as well.
Hmm. I appreciate that response, and also for pointing out that I was shifting from descriptive to evaluative topics,
Mm.
and I want to do that intentionally now. So
Yeah,
um,
sure. Yeah.
listening to Lil Wayne, I'm struck by how clever he is. And then listening to Miles Davis, I'm struck by how patient he is. So I want to think of these, cleverness and patience, as musical virtues. But then I remember beautiful pieces that aren't very clever. They're super simple, straightforward songs from maybe Bob Dylan. And he has clever things too, but then he has just where he seems like he's just describing things. And then there are wild songs that seem almost impatient with abrupt, off-putting changes from like Jacob Collier. But I like these songs too. So with respect to virtually any particular musical virtues I can think of, there seem to be exceptions, except beyond the broad, like if you just consider creativity a virtue, then yeah, every song I like is going to be creative, I guess. But I wonder, are there any more specific musical virtues that are pretty established, like how the epistemological virtue of humility is just kind of always there, or curiosity is just always there? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think in a way, this is a huge question in
Mm,
philosophy of the arts more generally. Um, I would, I mean, I'm not sure when I think about these sorts of issues, I think of it in terms of just because of the philosophical literature I'm familiar with, in terms of like aesthetic or artistic properties. Like when I think of virtues, I think of them as being like properties that people have, right? Like you were talking about
mm,
humility and so on. And so artists might have those sorts of virtues, but the artworks themselves, again, we can use the word virtues, but just to be clear, it seems like these are kind of properties of the artworks. Um, um, like you were saying, like some artworks are crazy, some artworks are calm, some artworks, they can be so different. Um, and I think, I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying, but I feel like all of these features can be good or bad. And it sort of depends a lot on the context in which they appear. Um, So you might think of like, it's just an analogy, but like an elegant line. You might think, well, an elegant line is always going to be a good thing in a painting. Um, but in a really kind of harsh painting with like lots of jagged
Mm,
lines and edges, everything that's trying to be like really kind of shocking or really kind of almost painful to look at, which can be a good thing, right? Um, and an elegant line, it's going to like totally change the work.
right.
I mean, maybe it's in a good way, maybe you're trying to do something with that, but it might be kind of in a bad way, right? You might have just messed up or something. Um, so I think it's very hard to find any properties that are like always good making features or bad making features. So, I mean, you mentioned creativity maybe, but that also might be cultural. So some people have said that's very much a kind of a Western cultural
Mm.
thing that, especially in the modern era, that you're supposed to always be doing something kind of new and individual, and it's tied to this conception of individuals and modernity as these autonomous beings. But in other cultures, you might find that music is all about trying to get pieces, classic pieces that already exist, right. I mean, you
Mm.
can actually see this in Western classical music, I think, but you can also see it in other traditions like, I believe, Balinese gamelan, where there's actually a lot less focus on kind of individual creativity and a lot more focus on kind of deference to the artistic tradition, if you like. Uh, yeah,
Yeah, no, yeah. So even the uh, the example I gave of creativity, how that I assume that was universal. It might not be universal because maybe others would value faithfulness to some historical tradition
right.
over,
Yeah,
individual self-expression. It's like very
right.
American of me to say
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so you were talking about how virtues, you think of them as more properties of people rather than their pieces. And I wonder, like, about a very virtuous musician, right? Like, we talk about musical geniuses, and I wonder what sense does that make? Like, how could someone be a musical genius? Because I think of just paradigmatic cases, right? Going to that prototype, I didn't know there was a word for that. I just think I don't know how to define a genius, but I think Miles
Right.
Davis is genius, right? And then other people, yeah. So but then the person for whom to whom genius is applied most often in popular culture now is Kanye West, interestingly. But Kanye has all sorts of his challenges, and then he has albums that everyone knows are classic and everyone knows are just really bad, especially recently. And so I don't know if consistency has to be a criterion, or ingenuity and innovation um, seem to be criteria. So I don't know. Like, I'm just asking it very broadly. What are we to make of the
Yeah.
concept of musical geniuses?
Yeah. It's not something I've thought about a lot. And maybe that's because my gut reaction is something like, I'm kind of suspicious of the word genius, because also I feel like it's tied to this kind of history of a certain way of thinking about art and other things in the West that's a little bit false. This idea that genius is somehow kind of these specially different kind of people. And I don't see evidence of that. I mean, you've already given some examples where it seems like, well, this person's a genius in one sense, right? But they've also got their own kind of issues. And I guess I just think that the most sense I can make of it is like a musical genius is just somebody who can come up with, I don't know about consistently, but can come up with many great new musical ideas. And there are people who are to a greater or lesser extent. I feel like it's kind of on a continuum or a spectrum. Um, and I don't think there's a sort of genius property per se. I think it's more like some people do some really awesome things, and then they stop doing things. They run out of ideas. Some people go a bit longer. Some people go like all of their lives doing kind of amazing things. I mean, in a way, I feel like it's sort of a cliche, but Picasso is a good example of this,
Hmm.
right? Again, I don't know a lot about visual art, but he just seems like he's he went through so many different phases of like totally different kinds of visual art,
Mm,
and raised many of them to extremely high levels. Just had an amazing kind of um, capacity for doing new and interesting things in the visual medium. Um, I mean, in a way, I think Taylor Swift is, it's still sort of relatively early days, but I mean, she's also someone who is, I think, a really great songwriter, but has very obviously kind of reinvented her musical persona many different times. And there's something very impressive about that. I mean, I think that's something Miles Davis also did to
mm.
some extent.
Right. So you would have just beyond the musical sphere, you'd have a problem with the term genius itself because intelligence or skill or creativity seems to be like a scale, and to just call this end genius doesn't make sense. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, something like that. I feel like the term comes along again. It might be my baggage from you know hanging around philosophers too much, but this idea that like genius is like this special kind of person, and
Mm,
it's kind of yeah category unto itself, and this might somehow. I mean, this is how you first raised the question. I think right. It's like, does that mean that they must be like people as well?
mm.
I feel like that seems all over the place. Like the relationship between musical skill and like moral goodness. I feel like there's no there's
Mm.
no direct correlation there at all, right? You've got lots of great artists who are kind of horrible people, great artists who are good people, terrible artists who are horrible people, terrible artists who are good people. You know, and I just feel like there's no obvious connection there.
Mm. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that, the relationship between art and ethics, and I often think in terms of the transcendentals of classic philosophy, truth, goodness, and beauty. Uh, so if it's a wonderful thing to learn and understand the true, and to cultivate habits of virtue or goodness, it seems comparably wonderful to appreciate and create and engage in music, which can be beautiful. But as much as I like thinking about, the transcendentals, I don't know how much of a role they play in contemporary philosophical discussion. So I'm just genuinely curious about, to what degree do the transcendentals affect academic thought and language today, if at all?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the short answer would be like, yeah, they are still at the root of everything we do.
Mm,
Uh, I think people might resist more than they would have in the past. Again, calling them transcendental,
mm,
since that suggests it might suggest a kind of metaphysical picture where they're kind of out there somewhere, kind of beyond our ken. And I think people are more suspicious about that kind of picture these days. But yeah, I mean, if you think about truth, you were talking about epistemology before, right? I mean, people are still doing epistemology. And what is that? Well, it's a study of something like knowledge and justification. And what does that mean? Well, it's like we really want to make sure we have an accurate picture of the world, right? Our picture of the world is true. So I think that notion of truth is like underlying epistemology. I think
right.
it's probably underlying metaphysics too, right? We want to know the way the world really is. That's another way of thinking about truth. Um, even in even in the arts, I think. So often when I'm kind of explaining philosophy of music to people or philosophy of the arts, I sort of take the one way of dividing up philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and you might think, well, epistemology, like that's theory of knowledge. Like, what does that have to do with like music? But I think if you think about understanding music, right, we're interested in what's going on. I think a lot of the questions you've asked, a lot of the discussion we've had today is about what is it to really like understand music? What's there in music to be gotten out of it by us? Uh, that's that's in some sense epistemology, right? It's about how we are related to the world. Are we
Mm,
related to it in a good way? And particularly, we're asking about kind of music in this case, as opposed to when we do epistemology, we often think about like scientific truth or something like that, or perception. Um, but when I have an experience of music, it's it's an experience of something that sorry, it's a very complex experience in some way. For instance, my dog can be in the same room as me when the stereo's on. My dog hears the sounds, but my dog doesn't hear the music, I don't think.
Mm,
Um, it's something about cognitive capacities that allows us to understand music. Thinking about that again is a way of thinking about truth. Um, Again, beauty. I think to some extent, um, well, I would want to kind of broaden the class there. So yes, beauty is like the classic aesthetic artistic property, but I think a lot of music can be powerful without being beautiful. I mean, so if you think about punk or even like bebop, jazz, or I mean, lots of different kinds of music, I feel like beautiful is not the first word that comes to mind for people.
mm.
Other music can be beautiful. I mean, you talked about Ella Fitzgerald earlier, I think. Definitely beautiful would be a way of characterizing her singing. Um, and that's really great. But I feel like there can also be like awesomely painful or ugly sounds
Mm,
that are also like really good, even though we might describe them as sort of ugly or noisy in some sense. Um, so in that sense, I feel like beauty I think is maybe a little bit narrow. People are definitely still interested in beauty and should be, but I think there's a much more kind of I think philosophers are a lot more open to thinking about other kinds of aesthetic or artistic properties than the kind of historical focus in modern Western philosophy on beauty.
mm. Man, that brings up a lot of questions in my mind. One is just about, the classic objectivity question, right? So most people are objectivists about truth. I don't even know what it would mean to deny that. Then I think the slight majority, um, as in philosophers, right? So most people are also objectivists about morality. I think, or at least just practically, they don't really think about meta ethics, but they tend to think, yeah, it's subjectively wrong to like torture a baby for fun. That's the classic example.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
But I think philosophers they tend toward objectivity or moral realism, but it's not as wide. And then when it comes to aesthetic realism or objectivism about beauty, I have no idea what most philosophers view. So I want to know what the general trends are in academia, but also if you yourself are more sympathetic to objectivism or subjectivism or intersubjectivism, with respect
Yeah,
to beauty.
yeah. Well, just to put my cards on the table, I'd say I'm probably an intersubjectivist about beauty and other kind of artistic or aesthetic features. As for what the trends are more generally, I'm not sure I'm qualified to say, but I think I can at least say. I mean, it's interesting that you say, you think most people are kind of leaning towards the objective side because I feel like when I teach philosophy to undergraduate students, people are constantly pushing subjectivism about everything, like
Mm,
including morality.
really?
And yeah, my response is often like, so you think it's not really wrong to like, murder a baby? Take your example, and they do feel uncomfortable about saying that, but somehow it's like when you get them in the philosophy classroom, they're all sort of knee-jerk subjectivists. Not all, but I'm surprised how much of that there is. And certainly when we talk about political value or artistic value, people think, at least in my classes, what people say at first is usually, well, it's just a matter of personal taste. It's subjective. You can't like tell anyone else that they're wrong about how good a song is. Uh, and I think there's a lot of philosophy. This is my long-winded way of getting around to the question of like academic trends in general. Um, I think if all of this stuff is subjective, then there's not much interesting to say about it philosophically, except like, well, that's just the way it is, and we can't like have any rational discussions about it because it's just subjective. So I think philosophers are going to be more interested automatically in the sorts of views that claim that musical quality or value or whatever, or beauty is not totally subjective. So the interesting question is something like, could musical value be something other than wholly subjective?
Mm.
Um, and I think the answer is yes. And I think most people do actually think the answer is yes, despite what they say in the philosophy classroom, because of course they're always recommending albums and songs and playlists to one another. They're always kind of talking about what's good about this song and what's bad about this song, and has this person sold out, or is this album better than that last one? When they're actually engaged with music themselves, I feel like the conversations are full of evaluative claims and reasoning, right? Trying to get people to hear a track in a certain different way. It's like, but did you like hear the kind of, the way the bass line is kind of under there, but it's not like foregrounded, but it's like really running the song kind of thing. They're appealing to these features that they think, if this person that I'm talking to just kind of notices that feature, they'll agree with me that this track is really great. And so I feel like when you look at people in the wild, as it were, when they're kind of actually engaging with music, they betray their objectivist tendencies. But when you get them in the philosophy classroom, somehow they think that they're not going to be able to defend this view. And I think it's partly because they're thinking, well, how could this be objective? Because it's just music, we just make it up. People like different things. But I think there's a lot more kind of complicated stuff going on here. So, one thing is just to distinguish between preference and evaluation. So you might, to take one of your examples again, you might say Miles Davis, just brilliant musician. But when I come home from work at the end of the day, I just can't handle Miles Davis because it's so demanding, on you kind of intellectually. You really have to listen to it. And so instead I put on some ambient stuff that's, not that interesting, but, fades in the background and helps me relax. So there are reasons we might listen to certain kinds of music that we think are less good than other kinds. That doesn't show that we think those musics that we're choosing to listen to are necessarily better than the other kinds, because really great art can be difficult to interact with. It's the same thing with films. I've got so many great films on my queues, and then I sit down at night and I'm like, what do I want to watch? It's like, oh, I could really use a rom-com. It's like I never get to watch these classic movies because I'm always too tired or something. So that notion of there being a difference between an evaluative judgment and a preference, or kind of just other reasons why you might be engaging with art than because it's good, is an important one. And another thing I think is important is to see is that you mentioned intersubjectivity, right? One reason you might think, well, musical value can't be objective. It's clearly about how it sounds to us, right? So that's subjectivity, right? It's going to sound different to different people. But I think you can push back against that by saying, well, to some extent, we all do have the same kinds of ears and brains. It's true we've got a lot of different kinds of musical experiences. So sometimes someone might recommend a track to you, and it's almost like they've given you a book in a language that you don't understand. You just don't know where to start. But of course, we can learn new languages, and we can learn new musical languages too. And so again, I feel like, if people can learn radically different ways of kind of hearing and thinking, and once you understand a kind of tradition and how it works, you can start to see why people think, oh yeah, these albums or songs or works or whatever are the classics, and these ones are not so good. And so you're somehow starting to share these norms of evaluation. So it's definitely reliant on our experiences, and thus to some extent subjective, but it's not purely subjective. It's not individualistic. It's a kind of shared subjectivity. So that's the kind of intersubjective idea.
Yeah, no, that's so cool. And it's cool because as you're describing it, I'm realizing that I live as if music is as the beauty of music is intersubjective anyways. And so I didn't really grow up, or I guess I'm not really growing up on rock and roll. I grew
Uh,
up on Stevie Wonder and on like 90s hip hop, jazz hip hop stuff. So when I hear like classic um, albums from Nirvana or just whoever, I can recognize, oh, this is supposed to be really good, but it's just not my taste. But
yeah,
I didn't take that as just, oh, it's not for me. Music, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. You like it, I won't like it. I like
right.
I try to train myself to like things, because I want to appreciate as much as a variety of different kinds. And so I listen and I keep listening. And I don't know if it's like I don't think it's self-delusion. I think it's me actually practicing developing my tastes, or so now I can appreciate like a real rockin' Nirvana song, or I just listened to my first Radiohead album, and it was amazing. um and then for jazz too, like jazz is just, the first time you hear it, like not just nighttime jazz, but or like in the background jazz, but jazz musicians whose whole life is jazz. It can sound like just an eclectic, collection of notes. It's like, why don't you just play the right notes? And so I listened to an album by Thelonious Monk, and even does not have a smooth style of playing. He's
Hmm.
been criticized for that too. But I listened the first time, and I don't know if I enjoyed it, but I could hear it. Then I kept listening and came to really love it. So, all that to say, I have a few questions. One is, do, I keep asking, what sense does it make? What sense does it make to talk about, oh, she has great music taste, but he has bad music taste? It's so common to say, or maybe more specifically, his music taste is really limited or basic, or something like that. And then two, so one is about music taste, another is about, can you be incorrect about something? You mentioned that, like, one reason I think there's an objective component of music is that we think it's rational to debate music and to talk about the purpose of a bass line or something like. So could you be incorrect about a musical evaluation? And three is, would it be, and I can repeat these two. I just want to get them out so I don't
Yeah,
forget.
yeah, sure, sure.
Would it be irrational to prefer something that I evaluate as lesser, right? So if I prefer
Yeah,
listening to
yeah.
artist A, even though I think I know that artist B is a lot better, is that irrational?
Yeah, so maybe I'll do them in reverse order.
There you go.
It seems like I guess it's interesting. Again, my instinct is to the last question is just to say no, that's not rational.
Mm,
I mean, I feel like some of the examples I've just given kind of show that great artworks sometimes take a lot of effort to engage with, um, and so you might prefer to engage with a less great artwork, right? So I want to watch the rom com instead of Kane again because I'm tired. Uh, and so that doesn't seem like irrational. I guess just as I was formulating this answer, I was thinking like, oh, but wait, maybe you could say something like, other things being equal, it would be
mm.
irrational. So like, suppose you were totally relaxed and had all the time in the world and so on and so forth. But even then, I feel like if you actually try to follow that out to where you would say, yes, it would be irrational then if you managed to describe the case where you would say it would be irrational to want to engage with the less good artwork, you probably would have like described a situation where you're not really talking about a human being anymore, right? Like maybe God wouldn't listen to
Mm.
worse music and better music or something. Um, but if you have to go that far from our kind of ordinary kind of experiences, I think probably it's not a very interesting kind of claim. So I definitely don't think it's irrational. Um,
Right.
in fact, I might even go the other way. I think it might be. I've probably been irrational in this way before. When I was younger, before I let myself chill out a bit more, might have sort of like forced myself to go back and keep reading Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake
Mm.
because I know it's supposed to be great art, and I need to improve my artistic education or something. When really it would have been better for me overall to just like chill out and watch a fun movie instead. And
Right, there you go.
yeah, and I feel like say this was connected to the second question you had, but maybe it's not connected that closely. Well, I guess so. The second question is something like, can you be wrong in your artistic or aesthetic judgment? And I think the answer is yes. I think that just goes along with the kind of intersubjective view I was defending, right? So as soon as you get the intersubjectivity, as soon as it's less than purely individualistic or subjective in that strong sense, uh, then you're talking about some kind of standard that's independent of your own kind of immediate psychological experiences. And so you've got some basis for making a judgment of wrongness or incorrectness or something like that. And I think we probably all have examples like this. I mean, I don't know what the best example is, but if somebody thought that Octopus's Garden is the best Beatles song, I'd just say like, I just don't get it. Like, what about this song? What about this song?
Yeah.
And that person could. I feel like, yeah, okay, maybe someone like I really trust, they're gonna like point out some features of Octopus's Garden that I haven't noticed before, or something, some deep meaning it has. But it seems like this person is probably just wrong.
Right.
It seems so
Or
likely they're wrong that I'm gonna think they're messing with me.
right. Or they could be confusing preference with evaluation. So maybe it's their favorite. Maybe they grew up
Yeah,
listening to it, or it's the first Beatles song they ever heard, right? And so they love it the most. But when they try to express it, it just comes out as it's the best. You know.
right, exactly. So yeah, that's right. So they can't be wrong about, well, maybe even that's not true, but they're
Mm.
much less likely to be wrong about their preferences. Yeah, but yeah, it seems like again, it's part of the intersubjectivity thing. It's like I want to hear some reasons
Hmm.
here, and if they can't give me reasons, or if the reasons are subjective, like as you say, it's like, oh, it's the first Beatles song I ever heard, or my mother used to play this all the time when I was a kid. Then it seems like, okay, those are subjective reasons for preference. They're not intersubjective reasons for evaluation.
Mm. Right. And then the first question of the three was,
Yeah,
what about comparing music tastes, and to say that this
yeah,
person, they have good music taste because they listen to classical and rock and jazz, but this person not so much because they only listen to, like the radio or something. I don't know.
yeah. I feel like there's sort of, I mean, there's at least a couple of things going on here. Some of which we talked about before, right?
Hmm.
So, I mean, the one we haven't talked about before, I guess, is kind of the breadth versus narrowness one, right? So,
Mm.
it seems to me like somebody can listen to a lot of different kinds of music, but still not have good taste, right? So, the taste word makes it sound like it's to do with kind of evaluation or something. Somebody can just listen to like, songs randomly on Spotify and like enjoy them all, but that's about enjoyment or preference or something. But if they can't sort of make any distinctions between them,
Mm.
like say, oh yeah, the song's good too. Oh yeah, the song's good too. Oh, yeah, the song's good. It's like,
Mm.
well, okay, you're right. But like they're not all like exactly the same, right? Like are some better than others, or like do you like some more? It would be pretty weird, I think, if somebody who didn't have any preferences even
Mm.
at all. But again, I think when we talk about people with good musical taste, we mean that um, we mean that they're good evaluators or good judges of
Mm.
music. Uh, and I think somebody can be a good judge of just a narrow band of music, right? So someone might have really good taste when it comes to classical music because that's what they're most familiar with or something. But you wouldn't think, and maybe they wouldn't think either, that they had any kind of authority to talk about hip hop or jazz or rock or anything else. Um, some people are amazing. They listen to a lot of different kinds of music and seem to know a lot about all of them, understand them all quite deeply, and have good taste about all of them. I think that's very impressive. Um, but I'm not sure if I think it's a virtue, to go back to one of your other words. I think it would be a problem if somebody only listened to classical music, say, because they thought all other music was not worth it.
Hmm.
But if it's all kind of like, this is the music I grew up with, I don't have time to learn other kind of musical traditions or something, that seems kind of reasonable. So it's maybe a little bit more about how they, especially when we're talking about the virtue kind of side, how they kind of present their expertise and preferences. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's all I got to say.
No, yeah. No, that's good. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Um, Another thing that's coming into my mind is what I think about most probably is albums. I like it's music generally, but it's specifically albums, and it's probably just my human nature to like do battles, right? So, is this album better than that album, or the three best albums of the 70s, or things like that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I want to talk about comparative musical.
Sure.
But before I talk about the comparison, I kind of want to ask about albums themselves because I've learned somewhat recently that albums are somewhat recent, relatively recent occurrence phenomena in the history of music, and I don't really know what that means. I've heard that there was an album era, and maybe this is a better question for like a historian of art or music, but I'm sure you could shed some light on the nature of albums as I don't know, a body of work, or like what preceded it and what
Yeah,
led to their
yeah.
development.
Yeah, well, I can't talk about the history very much. As you say, that would be kind of a music historian's or a musicologist's view. But I think there's a philosophical question here about just kind of like the way I would put it. Some people don't like this way of thinking about it, but um, what is the work of art in a given tradition?
Mm,
Um, so uh, for rock and maybe popular music more generally, a landmark book in philosophy of music was Ted Graysick's Rhythm and Noise from 1996. Uh, and one of the main arguments of that book is, look, when we're talking about popular music, what we're talking about is recorded tracks. People talk kind of loosely all the time about songs and performances, but when you look at what they're actually focused on, what they're actually evaluating and discussing, they're talking about specific recordings. And so these recordings are the works of art in rock music, as opposed to, say, classical music, right? In classical music, just like in rock music or pop music more broadly, you have compositions, you have performances of those compositions, you have recordings of performances or compositions or however you want to talk about it. But it seems like in classical music, the composition itself is considered the work, and you listen to the work by listening to a performance of the work. In rock music, Graysick was saying, and again, lots of people have extended this to pop music more generally, you're listening not sort of primarily to the song, but actually to the sonically replete recording in all of its detail. That's the
mm,
medium that the musicians are working with, recorded sounds. Um, but this raises a further question of like, okay, so, what is the actual like artwork here? Is it, for instance, the individual track, or is it the whole album? And Grace only talks about this briefly, and I think philosophers haven't talked about this as much as they could. But I think some albums are sort of like, again, this is a pretty broad analogy, but sort of like symphonies in the classical tradition. So a
mm,
symphony is typically an orchestral work with four movements of certain kinds. There's a lot of kind of flexibility there, but you talk about, whether you know Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or Mahler's First Symphony, and you're talking about all four movements. And you would consider playing just one of the movements, even though it's a standalone piece of music in a sense, it's got a beginning and end. Um, that's only part of the symphony.
mm.
And when you think about albums as a kind of artistic unit, I think of them as a little bit like that. And that sort of picture makes more sense for some others, and maybe even for some tracks on some albums than others. So for me, growing up, like Pink Floyd was the big kind of like
Hmm.
concept album artists I listened to. So if you think about Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall or The Final Cut, uh, these were considered great albums in the sense that there's been kind of united and they've got a broad narrative or thematic arc. Um, and some of the tracks just don't work if you listen to them as a, they could never be released as a single.
Like On the Run.
Um, yeah, exactly. Um, but other tracks, of course, were released as incredibly successful singles, like Money, to take one example. Uh, so something's going on there,
Hmm.
and maybe there's not much more to say than that. But the idea that the album as a unit became more important in the maybe even from the beginning of the rock era.
Hmm.
I mean, again, I think historians would be able to say more about this, but I feel like at the beginning, an album was often kind of structured as sort of like a set list that you would hear in a performance, but
Hmm.
of course restricted by technological limitations. But then you got these more kind of conceptual albums, and I mean, even like the Beatles, I think maybe you could talk about Dylan as doing this, but I think the Beatles is probably the first case where you get something sort of like a concept album, and then it kind of really flowers in the 70s, I guess. And then, of course, it's always around. So some people are doing it less or more. You mentioned Radiohead; they're probably a classic example. People talk about them as doing concept albums. Um, and now, of course, we've got this really interesting phenomenon where we're streaming songs, and the unit is usually the track. So the albums still exist in some sense, but there's much less of a technological limitation, for instance, on how long an album can be. Um, and I think this does have artistic or aesthetic effects. In fact, I'm teaching this Taylor Swift course this semester, and someone was saying, I'm going to get the song wrong, but it's actually called The Trees, but there was some song, and someone in the class was saying, it has a really kind of like last song feel. Like, is it the
Hmm.
last song in the album? And people looked it up. It's like, no, it's not the last song of the album. And then I was like, well, she does release all of her stuff, as far as I know now, on vinyl as well. So like, is it the last song on one side of one vinyl album? Turns out that wasn't the case either.
Okay.
But I think because of the because of the way, purely in terms of technology, that music is now released, certain options don't have like the last song on the album doesn't have the same kind of weight that it did when albums were still
Hmm.
released on vinyl or
Hmm.
even CDs. I think.
Yeah, I mean that brings up a lot of questions too, makes me think about what would, because I felt that too. I'm like, wow, this works so well as an outro. It wouldn't work nearly as well towards the beginning of an album. Like
Right,
what was the
right.
last song on Dark Side of the Moon? Eclipse or something? It works.
Yeah,
It works
right.
perfectly. Or I'm a big Kendrick Lamar fan, and the his outros always feel conclusive, right? So on To Pimp a Butterfly, Mortal Man integrates themes from everything, and then it ends with a discussion where he, like throughout the album, he had been delivering parts of a poem, and then on the very last track, he gives the poem in full and then discusses it. So there are
Huh.
songs that have an outro feel to it, and then I also
Yeah,
I wonder about covers, right? Like the metaphysics of covering a song, where you take like at this point, "Smells Like Teen Spirit" has become a sort of jazz standard. In a way, it's like part of the Great American Songbook now, but you could do it in
mhm,
some weird time signature and change keys and mess with the
yeah,
structure. So lots of questions. So I really appreciate what you said, but one of the final things I want to talk about is like comparisons. So in some cases, it's easy to compare people, right? So like Aretha Franklin is undoubtedly a more skilled and tasteful vocalist than Drake, right? And Joni Mitchell is a better songwriter than this sort of new artist Playboy Cardi, or The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill is better than Invasion of Privacy. Um, so, I mean, to me at least, these are easy, and maybe we could. There's a whole conversation about that, but I'm just more concerned with the principle and like paradigmatic cases, because when there are
Mm.
closer calls, like what does it mean to say that "Songs in the Key of Life" by Stevie Wonder is more beautiful than John Coltrane's "My Favorite Things," or to say that "In Rainbows" by Radiohead is more powerful than "What's Going On" by Marvin Gaye? So I just want to ask you kind of bluntly and broadly, what do you make of comparative musical judgments? Because it seems like there's something there. There seems
Yeah.
to be degrees of beauty, but it's hard to really capture it when there's close calls.
Yeah. I absolutely think that's a great question. I think it's a great way into a bunch of issues in philosophy of music. Uh, I mean, if we just start with um, pure evaluations, so which one is better? Uh, I think, like you're saying, there's some easy calls, right? So some artists are clearly better than other artists, or some. That's probably even a tricky one, but
Mm.
specific songs, right,
Yeah,
are
there you
better
go.
than other songs. Um, so "Come Together" is a better song than "Octopus's Garden."
Right.
Something's
I,
going to be
I agree.
controversial, but I think that's a good one. Um, and in a way, I think there's kind of two different kinds of hard cases.
Mm.
So for one thing, like those easy cases suggest that again, there's these claims are at least not totally subjective, because it
Mm.
seems like people can get this wrong. That it must be missing something. One of us is missing something if we disagree about whether "Come Together" is better or worse than "Octopus Garden." Um, but one kind of hard case is where they're in the same kind of genre,
Mm.
right? So if you're comparing, um, I should have prepared some examples, but I don't
No,
know,
it's all good.
Joni Mitchell and Carole King or something, or
Mm.
one Miles Davis album and another Miles Davis album. I mean, the problem might be that they're both really good, and it's sort of hard to say like how we could judge whether one is better than the other. And it might be a kind of epistemic problem, right? Maybe it's just like
Mm.
really hard to tell, but there is an answer. Or maybe there just isn't an answer. And that could be because maybe they're exactly as good as one another. Or maybe because with these kinds of evaluations, there's again a kind of vagueness. Maybe there's just no fact of the matter about
Mm.
which one is better than the other, or even whether they're the same amount of goodness. Um, and that gets into really kind of deep and difficult questions about the nature of values. Like, is that even a coherent position? Um, the other kind of hard case, I think, is when you've got radically different comparisons, right? So if you say is better, um, OK Computer or Kind of Blue,
Hmm.
it's like, hold on, like, okay, they're both really good, and now what do we say? The problem here seems to be, in a way, the opposite one. Um, the, the reasons for which we think these two albums are so great are so different. It's like because they're in different
Mhm.
musical genres or traditions, the things that make each one good are totally different. And that makes it difficult to see like how we're supposed to kind of match up the ways in which we evaluate jazz from a certain era with rock from a certain era. Uh, so it's a different kind of problem, I think, from the problem where you've got two things that are both in the same ballpark of goodness from a similar kind of genre. Um, so I guess I think consider more profound to draw from this, except that um, it's a good way into thinking about some deeper, harder questions about
Mhm.
musical value, artistic value, aesthetic value. So I guess one way of putting it is like, even if you're on board, you've drunk my intersubjective Kool-Aid,
Mhm.
um, these problems don't just get solved by saying, well, musical value is intersubjective. It's like, these are still problems, hard cases to think about, even if we agree that musical value is intersubjective.
Yeah, like where do you even begin? You can't compare lyrics, okay, computer has lyrics and kind of blue doesn't, or even like if you're judging the feel, one is hard and the other is uh, distinctive because of how little it cares about the audience in a way, like it sort of it is this elevated thing that we're just supposed to appreciate, and the
Mm.
rhythms are different, the grooves are different. But I wonder, maybe all else being equal, you use that phrase, and that's a helpful one in philosophy. Um,
Right.
if there's two things, two let's say two songs that are all else being equal, pretty uh, comparably beautiful, would one be maybe diminished if its content is like morally heinous, right? Because sometimes I'll be listening to a song and I really like how it sounds, but there's a lyric where it's just like it's a little perverted, and I listen. I'm like, well, okay, where does that come? And it diminishes at least my experience of it sometimes. But there's that which is talked about often at the relationship between art and ethics. But then also, what about knowledge? I mean, art and knowledge. So if there's two songs that are all else being equal, comparably beautiful, but one is just really foolish, or a lot of its lyrics are like incorrect, demonstrably. Then does that change? Does that I'm going like this with my hands, but is that a real thing that
Yeah.
happens? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's a disputed topic for sure. Um, I think the most um, interesting and plausible argument in favor of that sort of view, that yes, it does make a difference, is sometimes called ethicism.
Mm,
Uh, and the idea is that artworks are always trying to get a certain response from us when we appreciate them. This is easiest to kind of explain with things like comedies and horror movies, right? If the horror movie doesn't scare you, it's a failure. If the comedy
right.
movie doesn't make you laugh, it's a failure. It's trying to get some sort of reaction with you. Often with narrative arts like song and film and literature, um, you're being asked to kind of sympathize with a character or a
Mm,
narrator, see things from their point of view, um, endorse certain things they're doing or thinking, or be happy when, for instance, the you know the love affair works out or something. Be sad if it doesn't. Uh, and I feel like songs are often trying to do that too. There's a narrator, there's a voice, right? There are these words, and it's often kind of from a character's point of view, and you're typically supposed to be kind of sympathizing with them. And if they then suddenly say something racist or sexist or whatever, um, you shouldn't continue to sympathize with them at that point, right? But that means that at that point, the song is not getting the reaction it's trying to get from you. Just
Mm,
like when in the comedy movie they tell a joke, but nobody laughs because it's just not funny. That makes the comedy worse because it's failing to elicit the kind of
mm,
response it's trying to get out of the audience. Similarly, the racist line is going to be a kind of obstacle to the audience's sympathizing with the narrator of the song, or whatever you want to call it. And so that's also going to be an artistic failure. Uh, so it's interesting. You talked about beauty before, and I wonder if what's going on here, right, is that with song you've got the, the music and the words in some sense. It's this kind of hybrid form, I would say. Uh, and it seems like the music can be beautiful, but if the lyrics are terrible, that's going to typically take away from the value of the song. Other things being equal in
yeah.
some way, if the lyrics were better with the same music, there would be a better song overall. And I think, yeah, cases of lyrics that block or should block our engagement because of their immorality might be cases like that.
Hmm. And that goes back into the intersubjective nature of music, because if we're, you could, some person might be just repulsed by a line, but another person might sympathize with the narrator even more because maybe if we're not talking about like a genuinely heinous thing, right? But just like
Mm,
someone's jealous, right? Or someone is, you know, maybe a little toxic in a relationship, right? And the song is an act of self-expression, and it draws people in because it's like, oh man, I feel for you, or I feel for the person, I don't know, you're mistreating or something like that. Like, um, it's a lot more complicated than just morally superior songs or artistically superior songs as well. There can
yeah,
be,
yeah.
there can be immorality that I don't know about maybe improve the beauty of a song, but it doesn't necessarily detract from a song. You think or no?
The immorality,
I'm not sure because
like
if the
immoral
immorality
content.
is, yeah, if immoral content is a form of self-expression, then I don't know if that necessarily detracts.
I see. Well, certainly according to the argument that I was just rehearsing, it would still detract. It's
Mm,
kind of, I mean, interesting enough, the kind of argument I was just rehearsing, I think is kind of independent of the question of whether the song is self expression or not.
hmm,
So the idea would be, even if you write a sexist lyric, um, because you think it'll sell,
mm,
despite the fact that you are not yourself sexist, that the song itself can still be morally criticized. Maybe you could even say, a song created by AI that turned out to be sexist is morally criticizable, even though no person is behind it.
hmm.
We don't criticize the AI because it's just a machine, it's not a person. But the song could still be morally bad and thus aesthetically bad for the sorts of reasons I was rehearsing earlier. Um, but I guess you're raising a separate issue here, which is kind of the role of, as philosophers put it, sort of personal authenticity in our evaluation, assessment, understanding of music. And again, people make different claims here about different kinds of music. So maybe popular music there's more of a role for kind of personal authenticity than there is in, say, Western classical music. Um, and can I say anything beyond like this is complicated? Um, I think it's really complicated, uh, and I think it's going to come back to issues about the nature of art and art interpretation. I mean, I've been thinking about this recently a little bit with Taylor Swift because I've been teaching this Taylor Swift
Right.
class, and on the one hand, it seems like she's, at least in the past, um, she is very much presented a lot of her songs as kind of about her life in some way, and especially in the kind of, outside the music itself, in terms of her like social media presence and stuff. There's been encouragement, and even actually like in the liner notes and things, hints or Easter eggs to try and get you to interpret the songs in part in terms of her real life. But as she's become more and more famous, and the effects of kind of super celebrity have kicked in, she's been much more pushing a more traditional artistic line about like, my songs are my work. They're not me. Like,
Hmm.
don't think that just because something happens in one of my songs, it has happened to me. Um, and this idea that, the artwork is autonomous in some sense, it's separate from the artist.
Hmm.
And it's good or bad independently of whether it's an authentic expression of their um, personality or views or beliefs. Uh, and I'm just not sure what I think about that.
Hmm.
An interesting question. Um, I guess I would say at the very least that if it turns out that personal authenticity is a good making feature of a song, um, that might weigh positively against. Sorry, I'm not sure how to say this
No,
exactly.
yeah, that makes sense.
That might be put in the balance, the opposite side of the balance from the kind of moral criticism of the song. So it's not gonna make the moral criticism go away, but it might be a kind of counterbalance and
Mm.
good feature of the work. At least it's personally authentic, even though it's immoral and
Yeah.
does bad in some way.
Yeah. No, yeah. So it's not like it dilutes, the immorality of the content, but it's a
Right.
counterweight. Yeah, on the
Yeah.
scale, like the overall scale.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
So lots of people have talked about this with all sorts of kinds of art. So um, when people make criticisms, particularly of like older art, that it's
mm,
like sexist, racist, and so on. A lot of these people are very harshly critical of this work. Sometimes say, I'm thinking here particularly of Susan McCleary, who said this about Western classical works,
mm,
particularly accusing them of being sexist or misogynistic. She's very explicit about the fact that, she doesn't think we should stop listening to these works because they have so many great features. It's just that we need to listen to them more critically and realize they do have these problematic aspects in addition to, their really great aspects.
mm, interesting. Well, the last question that I ask every guest is about a change of mind. So throughout your time, whether from academic study or personal conversation or life experience, whatever it is, what's something significant about which you've changed your mind? It could be related to music or not.
Yeah. Um, well, I'll give one example, the music example. I feel like I could give a few other examples too,
Hmm.
but in music, I talked earlier about Ted Grayson book Rhythm and Noise, which has this kind of ontological thesis that the focus of critical appreciation, what we're really kind of paying attention to in pop music, is a recording, not a performance. That had a kind of I feel like when I was reading that, I was doing my master's at Auckland when it came out in 1996. It had, I think I even described it in some article as a kind of Copernican effect on me. So, right, like
Mm,
Copernicus was the one to say, look, the Earth's not at the center of the universe, the sun is. Um, I felt like I had really struggled as someone who grew up and very much immersed in like Western classical music. I did find myself loving a lot of popular music, but when I thought about it, I thought, I can't understand why I love this so much because it doesn't seem as good as classical music. It
mm,
seems so much simpler, musically speaking. And I felt like when Graysick said, like, it's the track you're listening to, the recording, not just the kind of song, the way you might sort of study the structure of a Beethoven symphony or something. Um, that really resonated with me, right?
hmm.
It revealed something about the way I was experiencing the music that I sort of didn't realize until he pointed it out to me. Um, and that was hugely influential on the way I listened to popular music and probably lots of other music, and also on my professional life. I mean, I went on to write about those sorts of topics in my doctoral dissertation and since then. And here I am now teaching this course about Taylor Swift, partly because I find the Taylor's Versions project so philosophically interesting, right? Where she's doing these re-recordings, are they covers of her earlier work? What's going on when we hear these songs that are sonically, tracks that are sonically so close to the originals, and yet a lot of listeners are saying they sound very different in a lot of ways, not because of the sounds necessarily, but just because they're these later recordings of these earlier tracks, as it were. Um, so that was a huge influence on me, I think.
Wow. Wow, that's cool. And I think I can relate to part of that about, listening to popular music and liking it even though it's, I don't know, maybe five chords or something with a bridge rather than
Right.
like these musical masterpieces. So yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for your time too. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Oh,
Um,
it was my pleasure. Thanks again for having me on the show.
yeah, of course. And to our audience, I hope you've been challenged maybe and educated. So to everyone, peace out.